My son's wife invited 50 execs to my farm. Then I found my forged signature. There's a specific, hollow sound a sugar maple makes when the deep freeze of an upstate New York winter finally cracks. It's a subtle, almost imperceptible heartbeat beneath the heavy bark, the sound of the sap starting to run. You have to stand perfectly still in the freezing woods to hear it. I've stood in these woods, listening to that quiet rhythm, for 68 years. My grandfather bought Frost Hollow Farm in 1924 with nothing but a draft horse and a stubborn streak. He taught me the brutal, honest math of patience. It takes 40 gallons of clear, watery sap, boiled down over a roaring hardwood fire, just to make 1 single gallon of pure, liquid amber. There are no shortcuts. You can't rush the fire, and you certainly can't rush the trees. I raised my son, Theron, on that same math. I taught him that our family name on a glass bottle wasn't just a label, it was a promise. It meant we didn't compromise, not for weather, not for money, and not for convenience. These days, the world operates on a different kind of math. Speed, margins, unending growth. I never cared much for it. I prefer the quiet isolation of the sugar shack, the smell of wood smoke and caramelized sugar hanging heavy in the biting February air. At 68, my hands are permanently calloused, and my knees ache with a deep, familiar throb when the barometric pressure drops. But my mind is as sharp as the splitting maul I use for the cordwood. I know every inch of these 300 acres. I know when a tree is dying from the inside out, and I know when a lie is being born. The lie that almost cost me my legacy started on a Tuesday in late October, riding up my gravel driveway on the polished leather seats of a leased luxury SUV. Theron and his wife, Cressida, arrived just as the first real snow began to dust the roof of the main farmhouse. I watched from the porch as Theron wrestled 3 oversized, designer suitcases from the trunk, his shoulders hunched against the biting wind. Cressida emerged from the passenger side, pulling a cream-colored cashmere coat tightly around herself. It was a coat that had no business being anywhere near a working farm. "Silas," she called out, her voice sharp, bright, and entirely artificial, cutting through the crisp air. She didn't hug me. She never did. She offered a brisk, corporate nod. "It's freezing out here. Theron, please tell me you had them turn the heat up in the guest house." "I texted Branston to do it," Theron mumbled, struggling to keep the bags from dragging in the slush. He looked older than his 34 years, a permanent, exhausting tension settling around his jawline. "Texting isn't managing, Theron," she said smoothly, not bothering to look back at him. She walked past me and straight into the kitchen, her heels clicking aggressively against the worn hardwood floor my grandfather had laid by hand. I followed her inside, leaving my heavy boots on the porch mat out of habit. "Coffee," I offered, moving toward the battered percolator that sat on the counter. "Just hot water, if you have lemon," Cressida said, already pulling a sleek silver laptop from her tote. She spread her color-coded folders across the scarred oak dining table, the exact spot where my late wife and I had eaten thousands of quiet meals. "We have a lot of ground to cover, Silas. The first Frost Gala is in exactly 3 weeks. The invitations to the Apex supermarket executives are already out. We need to finalize the spatial flow of the dining area and make sure the rustic aesthetic doesn't feel too dirty." "It's a harvest dinner," I said quietly, handing her a mug of plain hot water. "Not a convention. And the evaporator room is going to be running full tilt. It gets loud, and it gets sticky." "It's an activation," Cressida corrected, flashing a tight, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We aren't just selling syrup at a roadside stand anymore, Silas. We're pitching a scalable lifestyle brand. Frost Hollow has been financially stagnant for a decade. The artisan revenue model is completely archaic." I looked over at Theron, who had finally carried the bags inside. He stood lingering in the doorway, staring intently at the floorboards, scraping a bit of mud off his expensive boots. "We do all right," I said to my son, my voice steady. "We pay our people. We keep the land healthy. Don't we, Theron?" Theron shifted his weight, looking anywhere but at me. "Well, Dad, Cressida has some really innovative ideas. The market is shifting. We can't just rely on local hardware stores and word of mouth anymore. We need volume." "Exactly," Cressida interjected, not giving him a second to finish his thought. She treated him less like a partner and more like an intern. "Theron agrees that the small batch approach is a massive bottleneck. We have the Apex executives coming up from the city. If they like the narrative we present, And the product, they're prepared to offer a regional distribution contract. 15,000 gallons for the first quarter. I set my coffee mug down. The ceramic clinked heavily in the quiet room. 15,000? We max out at 5,000 in a perfect season. 6 if the freeze-thaw cycle holds into April. You can't squeeze blood from a stone, Cressida, and you can't squeeze extra sap from a maple tree. Optimization, Silas, she said, tapping a manicured fingernail against her screen. We've identified some workflow efficiencies. Theron is handling the production logistics. Aren't you, honey? I'm handling it, Dad, Theron said quickly, his voice lacking any real conviction. He looked thoroughly exhausted, a man hollowed out by 1,000 tiny, daily concessions to keep the peace in his marriage. He was my blood, the boy I taught to respect the forest, but looking at him right then, standing in the cold shadow of his wife's relentless ambition, I hardly recognized him. The real scope of their optimization arrived 3 days later. I was walking back from the lower ridge, having just checked the tension on the main gravity lines, when I heard the heavy grind of air brakes. A commercial delivery truck was backing up to the old tractor shed, a corrugated metal building we hadn't used for active production in years. Branston, my foreman and a man who had worked this land with me for 2 decades, was standing by the open bay doors, scratching his gray beard with a clipboard in his hand. What is it, Branston? I asked, approaching the heavy pallets being unloaded onto the dirt floor. Not sure, boss, he muttered, his brow furrowed as he handed me the shipping manifest. Ordered under Theron's name. Paid in full. I walked past Branston and looked at the pallets. Dozens of heavy, industrial blue drums wrapped in thick, clear plastic were stacked shoulder-high. There were no Frost Hollow Farm labels. I stepped closer, squinting at the small, sterile white manufacturer's sticker pasted on the side of the nearest drum. Premium commercial sweetener. High fructose corn syrup, HFCS, 55. Grade A artificial maple flavoring. My chest tightened, a cold knot forming in the pit of my stomach. It felt like a physical blow to my ribs. Silas, Cressida's voice rang out from across the gravel yard. She was marching toward us, her phone clamped to her ear, looking distinctly panicked for a split second before her corporate mask slid back into place. Those were supposed to go to the secondary storage unit in town. What is this, Cressida? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet rumble. She didn't flinch. She just straightened her posture. It's for a new secondary product line. A commercial baking partnership. Glazes for industrial bakeries. They don't need pure syrup. They just need the flavor profile to hit a price point. It's a completely separate revenue stream. It was a smooth answer. Impeccably smooth. She looked me right in the eye, her expression a perfect portrait of exasperation, as if I were a child failing to grasp a simple concept. But it was a lie. She didn't know that I had already noticed the new PVC piping Theron had haphazardly routed near the main holding tanks in the sugar shack late the night before, pipes that fed directly into the finishing vats. I turned away from her without another word, my jaw set, and walked straight across the yard to the evaporator room. The fire was roaring, the air thick with sweet steam. A fresh batch of syrup, overseen by 2 new contractors Cressida had brought in from the city, was cooling in the stainless steel finishing vat. I grabbed a wooden tasting spoon from the rack, dipped it into the thick amber liquid, and brought it to my lips. For 100 years, Frost Hollow syrup tasted like the wild earth. It had a complex, smoky finish with subtle notes of vanilla, caramel, and raw timber. It tasted like hard work. The liquid on my tongue was cloying. It was aggressively, sickeningly sweet, entirely flat, and completely devoid of soul. It left a metallic, chemical film on the roof of my mouth. It tasted like cheap diner syrup. It tasted like betrayal. They weren't building a secondary product line. They were cutting my family's life's work with chemical sludge to fulfill a supermarket contract we had no business signing. And as that sickeningly sweet taste lingered, burning the back of my throat, I realized with absolute, cold clarity that my daughter-in-law wasn't just trying to change my farm. She was actively stealing its soul, and she had turned my own son into her accomplice. But standing there in the heat of the evaporator room, I didn't yell. I didn't throw the spoon. I just wiped my mouth with the back of my calloused hand. She thought I was just a tired old man who didn't understand modern business. She was about to find out what 100 years of patience actually looks like. That night, the cold settled over Frost Hollow Farm like an iron blanket. By 1 in the morning, The lights in the guest house had finally flickered off. I sat in my kitchen in the dark, watching the frost creep across the window panes, waiting another full hour just to be sure. The old grandfather clock in the hallway ticked off the seconds, heavy, rhythmic, and indifferent to the collapse of my family. When I finally stepped out onto the back porch, Branston was already there. He materialized from the shadows of the woodpile, a heavy mag light gripped in his gloved hand. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Branston had been working this land with me since Theron was in middle school. He knew the rhythm of the farm, and he knew when that rhythm was broken. The new contractors left at midnight, Branston whispered, his breath pluming in the freezing air. Cressida locked the tractor shed herself, used a new brass padlock, not one of ours. Good thing my grandfather built the hinges on the outside, I muttered. We made our way across the frozen gravel, our boots crunching louder than I would have liked. The wind howled through the bare branches of the maples, masking our approach. We reached the corrugated metal wall of the tractor shed. Branston pulled a Leatherman from his belt, silently unscrewing the heavy iron hinges of the side door. In less than 2 minutes, we slipped inside the cavernous, freezing space. Branston clicked on his flashlight, shielding the beam with his thick fingers so it only cast a narrow pool of light. The smell hit me before I even saw the evidence. It was a cloying, artificial vanilla caramel scent, thick and unnatural, masking the familiar odors of motor oil and cold dirt. We moved past the pallets of high-fructose corn syrup I had seen earlier that day. Behind them, hidden beneath a heavy canvas tarp, was the real graveyard. Branston pulled the tarp back. Dozens of empty, flattened cardboard boxes and crushed plastic jugs were stacked haphazardly. I knelt down, shining my own small pen light on the labels. Grade a maple flavoring, industrial concentrate. Look at this, Branston growled, aiming his light at the corner. There was a makeshift pumping station. A heavy-duty electric sump pump sat in a plastic basin, connected to the thick PVC piping I had noticed Theron installing the night before. The pipe ran out through a ventilation grate in the wall, burrowing under the snow directly toward the sugar shack's finishing vats. My chest felt tight, hollowed out by the sheer mechanical efficiency of the betrayal. I stood up and walked over to a metal folding table that Cressida had apparently repurposed as a shipping desk. A clipboard lay face down on it. I flipped it over. It was a commercial invoice from a chemical supply distributor in New Jersey. The quantities were staggering. Thousands of gallons of HFCS, 55. Hundreds of liters of chemical flavoring. Billed directly to an LLC I didn't recognize, Frost Hollow Ventures. They're bypassing the evaporators entirely for half the batch, Branston said, his voice laced with disgust. Boiling just enough real sap to make the room smell right for the contractors, then pumping this garbage directly into the finishing vats. They're cutting it, Silas. Cutting it deep. Put the tarp back, I said, my voice barely a rasp. Screw the door hinges back exactly as they were. Don't leave a single boot print. As Branston worked, I stood in the dark, staring at the plastic jugs that were systematically erasing a century of my family's integrity. The artificial sweetness in the air made my stomach turn. By 3 a.m., I was back in the main house. The wind had picked up, rattling the old window frames. Cressida had left her sleek silver laptop and her neatly stacked, color-coded folders on my dining room table. She felt so utterly secure in her dominance, so confident in my obsolescence, that she hadn't even bothered to pack them away. I sat at the head of the oak table and turned on a single, dim reading lamp. I didn't need to hack into her computer. The paper trail was sitting right there in a transparent blue folder labeled Apex Commercial, Q1 Activation. I opened the folder. Inside was a finalized, signed supply contract with Apex Supermarkets. I put on my reading glasses and traced my calloused finger over the heavy, corporate print. The terms were laid out with ruthless precision. Frost Hollow Farm was contracted to deliver 15,000 gallons of premium heritage maple syrup to Apex's regional distribution center by the second week of December. I stared at the number. 15,000 gallons. The math was impossible. It takes roughly 40 gallons of maple sap to yield 1 gallon of pure syrup. To produce 15,000 gallons, the farm would need to harvest 600,000 gallons of sap. We had 300 acres. We tapped roughly 5,000 trees. Even in a miracle year, with a perfect freeze-thaw cycle stretching for 6 weeks, The absolute maximum yield this land could physically give without killing the trees was 5, maybe 6,000 gallons of syrup. To meet this contract, they weren't just stretching the product, they were drowning it. Based on the numbers, the final product going into those Apex bottles would be barely 30% real maple. The rest was the chemical sludge sitting in my tractor shed. Cressida was going to take our family name, a name that had stood for unyielding quality through the Great Depression, through 2 world wars, through decades of lean winters, and plaster it on bottles of artificially flavored corn syrup on the bottom shelf of a discount supermarket. And the moment the federal food inspectors or a discerning competitor tested a single batch, the Frost Hollow name would be legally and publicly destroyed. We would be exposed as frauds. The fines alone would bankrupt us. I flipped to the penalty clause. Failure to deliver the 15,000 gallons on time, or failure to meet quality consistency, resulted in a breach of contract penalty of $400,000, with the farm's assets listed as collateral. She had bet the entire farm on a lie. She had engineered a situation where we either sold poison to the public or we lost the land to the supermarket's lawyers. I closed the folder, my hands trembling slightly, not from age, but from a deep, subterranean rage. I looked toward the guest house through the frosted window. My son was sleeping in there. The boy I had taught to identify the health of a tree by the color of its leaves. The boy who knew this math just as well as I did. The final, fatal blow didn't come from the sugar shack or the dining room table. It came 3 days later, in a sterile law office in downtown Albany. I had quietly driven into the city under the pretense of buying replacement evaporator valves. Instead, I sat across from Arthur Penhaligon, a real estate and estate planning attorney my family had used for 20 years. Arthur was a meticulous man who rarely showed emotion, but as he slid a thick manila envelope across his polished mahogany desk, his expression was grim. "I pulled the county records like you asked, Silas," Arthur said gently, folding his hands. "You need to brace yourself." I opened the envelope. Inside was a deed of trust and a commercial mortgage agreement. Principal amount, $1,500,000. Lender, Northeast Commercial Equity. Collateral, 312 acres, Frost Hollow Farm, inclusive of all structures and equipment. $1.5 million, I whispered, the numbers swimming on the page. I own this farm free and clear. I haven't had a mortgage since 1998. The loan was originated 6 weeks ago, Arthur explained, pointing a silver pen at the second page. The funds were wired to an account under the name Frost Hollow Ventures. According to the state registry, that LLC is managed solely by Cressida. She couldn't borrow against my land, I said, my voice hardening. My name is on the deed. Mine alone. Turn to page 14, Arthur said quietly. I turned the heavy, legal-sized pages. There, at the bottom of the authorization document, was my signature, Silas Theron Vance. I stared at the blue ink. It was perfect. The sharp slant of the S, the slight trailing fade on the E in Vance. It was my handwriting, but I hadn't signed it. I pulled my reading glasses down and brought the paper inches from my face. I looked closely at the loop of the L in Silas. There was a microscopic, faded gray speck just above it. A printer anomaly. It's from the 2021 tractor lease, I said, the realization hitting me like a physical weight. I signed that lease in blue ink. The scanner glass in the farm office has had a scratch over the L for 5 years. It leaves a tiny gray dot on every scan. It's a digital lift, Arthur confirmed, nodding slowly. Pixel for pixel. They copied your signature, printed it onto the loan authorization, and ran it through a high-end color copier to make it look like wet ink. I felt the air leave my lungs. Cressida had stolen $1.5 million against my grandfather's dirt to fund her massive chemical syrup operation and her luxurious activation gala. Arthur, I said, my voice barely a whisper, to secure a commercial loan of this size against a primary agricultural property, the bank would require a notary. Someone had to verify that I was standing in front of them when this was signed. Arthur didn't say anything. He just reached across the desk and gently flipped to the final page of the document, the notary acknowledgement. There was the stamp, and beneath it, the signature of the witness who swore under penalty of perjury that Silas Vance had personally appeared to sign the document. The name on the witness line was Theron Vance. The silence in the office was absolute. I stared at my son's signature. It wasn't forged. It was messy, hurried, the T sharply angled exactly the way he always wrote it. A tear, hot and unbidden, broke loose and tracked down the deep creases of my weathered cheek. I didn't wipe it away. Theron knew. He didn't just look the other way while his wife brought cheap corn syrup onto our land. He didn't just quietly route the PVC pipes in the dark to help her cut the product. When she needed to steal the very dirt beneath our feet, when she needed someone to look a banker in the eye and lie about my presence, my son had picked up the pen. He had sold out 100 years of our family's blood and sweat to buy his wife's approval. He had mortgaged my life's work to build his own lie. Silas, Arthur asked softly, do you want me to call the police? This is federal wire fraud. It's felony forgery. I can have an injunction filed by noon. I looked out the window of Arthur's office, watching the gray winter clouds gathering over the city skyline. If I called the police now, it would be a quiet arrest, a messy family squabble buried in legal paperwork. Cressida would hire expensive lawyers with the stolen money. She would spin a narrative of a confused old man resisting modernization. She would drag the Frost Hollow name through years of litigation. No, my grandfather didn't build this farm with lawyers, and I wasn't going to save it with them. I gathered the papers, sliding them carefully back into the manila envelope. I stood up, the pain in my knees flaring, sharp and grounding. No, Arthur, I said, my voice steady, stripped of all grief, leaving only cold, hard bedrock. Don't file the injunction yet. Just get me certified copies of the chemical analysis from the state food inspector. I want every additive in that syrup documented and sealed. Arthur frowned. Silas, what are you going to do? The first Frost Gala is in a few days. They have 50 executives and investors coming to your farm. I buttoned my heavy wool coat. I know, and I wouldn't dream of ruining Cressida's big activation. I walked out of the office and into the biting cold. The sap was going to run, and the fire was going to burn. And by the end of the week, I was going to boil the truth down until there was nothing left but the bitter, undeniable end. The main equipment barn at Frost Hollow Farm had been stripped of its soul. For 40 years, that structure had housed diesel tractors, pallets of raw timber, and the heavy, grease-stained tools of our trade. But on the evening of the first Frost Gala, I barely recognized it. Cressida had hired a logistics company from Manhattan to transform the working barn into what she called an immersive agrarian experience. Thousands of twinkling fairy lights were draped across the exposed wooden rafters, casting a sterile, white glow over the floor, which had been covered in imported, wide-plank faux hardwood. Industrial heating lamps hummed in the corners, fighting back the biting November chill that seeped through the corrugated walls. In the center of the room sat a massive, horseshoe-shaped dining table dressed in crisp white linen, adorned with elaborate centerpieces of frosted pine cones and perfectly uniform, chemically treated maple leaves. A string quartet played a hollow, classical rendition of a pop song in the corner. The air smelled of roasted duck, expensive perfumes, and a subtle, artificial vanilla sweetness that made the back of my throat burn. They were boiling a small, sacrificial pot of the chemical sludge in the adjacent room, just enough to pump the scent through the HVAC system to create an authentic atmosphere. I stood near the coat check, dressed in my late father's tailored charcoal wool suit. It was out of fashion, slightly frayed at the cuffs, but it was honest. I watched as 50 of the most influential figures in regional commerce mingled over champagne flutes. There were vice presidents from Apex supermarkets, regional directors of Northeast Commercial Equity, and an assortment of wealthy, soft-handed investors from Cressida's personal network. Cressida was entirely in her element. She wore a slate-gray evening gown that looked like liquid smoke, moving from cluster to cluster with a practiced, predatory grace. I watched her approach Richard Sterling, the senior VP of purchasing for Apex, a man whose signature alone could make or break a regional brand. Richard, it is so thrilling to finally have you on the actual soil, Cressida purred, touching his forearm lightly as she signaled a waiter to refill his glass. We're scaling heritage tonight. We're taking a century of tradition and giving it the infrastructure to feed the entire eastern seaboard. It's a beautiful setup, Cressida, Sterling replied, looking around with an approving nod. Though I have to admit, your volume projections in the contract are incredibly ambitious for a farm this size. Innovation, Richard, she smiled smoothly, her teeth flashing in the fairy lights. We've optimized the extraction and finishing processes. We aren't just farmers anymore, we're engineers of flavor. I remained by the wall, invisible. Every time an investor happened to glance my way, Cressida would casually steer them away, offering a patronizing smile in my direction. At one point, she actually waved me over just to hand me her empty champagne flute. "Silas, be a dear and set this by the bar, would you? And make sure the caterers know we're 5 minutes from seating." She turned back to her guests before I even took the glass. "That's my father-in-law, the original founder's grandson. He's retiring this winter, bless his heart." It's hard for the older generation to comprehend the scale of modern logistics, but we love having his rustic energy around. Across the room, Theron stood by the makeshift bar. He was already on his third glass of neat scotch. His tuxedo looked too tight around the collar. He was sweating despite the draft in the barn, his eyes darting nervously toward the doors, toward the investors, and finally, toward me. When our eyes met, he quickly looked down at his shoes. He looked like a man standing on a trapdoor, waiting for the lever to be pulled. He didn't know that my hand was already on it. At 8 o'clock, the catering staff ushered everyone to their seats at the horseshoe table. The string quartet faded to a halt. Cressida stepped up to a sleek acrylic podium positioned at the head of the room. Behind her, a massive projector screen hummed to life, displaying a highly stylized, minimalist logo, Frost Hollow Ventures. "Ladies, gentlemen, esteemed partners," Cressida began, her voice amplified flawlessly through the hidden speakers. She projected absolute, unshakable confidence. "Welcome to the first frost. Tonight, we aren't just celebrating the harvest. We are celebrating a metamorphosis." I sat at the very end of the table, the seat traditionally reserved for an afterthought. I folded my hands on the white linen, feeling the thick, manila envelope resting heavy in my inner breast pocket. For 100 years, this farm has been constrained by the limitations of the past, Cressida continued, clicking a remote. The screen changed to a sepia-toned photograph of my grandfather, followed by a drone shot of our woods. Nature is beautiful, but nature is inconsistent. And in the modern retail landscape, inconsistency is death. Apex Supermarkets doesn't deal in maybe. The investors in this room don't deal in hopefully. You deal in guarantees. She paced slightly away from the podium, making direct eye contact with Richard Sterling. My husband, Theron, and I recognized that Frost Hollow was sitting on an untapped goldmine of brand equity. The name means trust, but the production model meant stagnation. So we evolved. We brought in new technologies, new processing partnerships, and a new vision for what maple syrup can be. She clicked the remote again. A rendering appeared on the screen, showing my farm bulldozed and replaced by massive steel-sided industrial facilities and a fleet of commercial delivery trucks. With the capital injection from our partners at Northeast Commercial Equity and the unprecedented 15,000-gallon distribution contract with Apex, we are officially bridging the gap between artisanal heritage and corporate reliability. We are preserving the soul of the farm while giving it the muscle of a modern enterprise. Applause rippled through the room. Investors nodded approvingly. Richard Sterling raised his glass toward her. "And to officially pass the torch," Cressida said, her smile widening into something that looked dangerously like pity, "I'd like to invite the man who kept the lights on for the last 40 years to say a few words. My father-in-law, Silas Vance." The applause shifted to me, polite but patronizing. A few people looked at their watches. They expected a rambling, nostalgic anecdote from a tired old man before the main course was served. I stood up. My knees popped loudly in the sudden quiet of the barn. I didn't rush. I walked the length of the horseshoe table, my boots thudding softly against the faux hardwood floor. When I reached the podium, Cressida stepped aside, leaning in to whisper, "Keep it under 2 minutes, Silas. The duck is getting cold." I didn't look at her. I stepped up to the microphone, adjusting it downward with a sharp scrape of metal that made a few executives wince. I looked out over the sea of wealthy, expectant faces. Then, I looked at Theron, who had suddenly gone entirely pale, his knuckles white around his water glass. I reached into my breast pocket and withdrew the manila envelope. I looked toward the back of the room and gave a single, slight nod. Branston stepped out from the shadows of the kitchen doors. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing his heavy Carhartt jacket, smelling of wood smoke and real work. In his arms was a stack of thick, blue-bound folders. Without a word, he began walking down the exterior of the table, placing a folder precisely in front of Richard Sterling, the bank executives, and every major investor. "My grandfather," I spoke into the microphone, my voice a low, gravelly baritone that echoed off the high rafters, taught me that a man's name on a bottle is a contract. It means you don't compromise. It means the truth of what you are selling is absolute. I turned to Cressida. Cressida is right about one thing. Nature is inconsistent. To make 15,000 gallons of pure maple syrup by December, we would need to boil roughly 600,000 gallons of sap. We have 5,000 trees. The physical, biological limit of this land is 5,000 gallons. Period. A murmur of confusion rippled through the table. Richard Sterling frowned, opening the blue folder placed in front of him. So, how does a company guarantee Apex Supermarkets 15,000 gallons of a product that the earth cannot physically provide? I asked the room. I picked up Cressida's presentation remote from the acrylic podium. You don't farm it. You fake it. I clicked the button. Cressida's rendering of the industrial park vanished. In its place, projected 15 feet high, was a scanned document bearing the official seal of the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets. In stark, bold letters at the top, it read, Laboratory Analysis, Official Notice of Adulteration. That is the chemical breakdown of the innovative product currently sitting in the finishing vats of my sugar shack, ready to be bottled under my family's name. I said, my voice cutting through the rising whispers like a scythe. 80% high-fructose corn syrup, 15% water, 5% grade A artificial flavoring, not a single drop of real maple sap. Richard Sterling's face drained of color. He flipped rapidly through the pages in his folder, his eyes darting across the lab results. What is this? Sterling demanded, his voice cracking with sudden alarm. He looked at Cressida. Are you planning to put the Apex label on an adulterated food product? Do you have any idea of the federal liability? It's a misunderstanding. Cressida lunged toward the podium, her serene mask shattering instantly. Silas is confused. He doesn't understand the supply chain logistics. That's a secondary, off-brand batch for commercial bakeries. No, I interrupted, my voice booming through the speakers, freezing her in her tracks. I didn't raise my pitch. I just projected the raw, undeniable weight of a man who owned the ground beneath their feet. It is the only batch on this property. Branston locked down the sheds this morning. State inspectors verified the inventory at noon. If Apex shelves that product as premium heritage maple, you won't just be facing a breach of contract. You will be facing federal wire fraud and FDA indictments for mass consumer deception. The table erupted. Two of the Apex lawyers immediately stood up, pulling out their phones. The bank representatives from Northeast Commercial Equity began frantically whispering to each other. Shut the projector off. Cressida screamed at the sound technician in the corner, her composure entirely gone. She clawed at the podium, trying to wrestle the microphone away from me. He's senile. He's trying to ruin his own son's business out of spite. I held the microphone stand with a grip forged by decades of splitting cordwood. She couldn't move it an inch. My son's business. I asked quietly. I clicked the remote a second time. The lab report vanished. The screen was immediately filled with the 14-page commercial mortgage agreement. I clicked again, zooming in heavily on the final signature page. My forged signature, Silas Theron Vance, loomed massive over the room. 2 weeks ago, Northeast Commercial Equity wired $1.5 million to an LLC controlled solely by my daughter-in-law. I addressed the bankers directly. The loan was secured using this farm as collateral. I own this farm free and clear. I did not authorize this loan. I did not sign this document. I clicked the remote one final time. The projection zoomed in on the microscopic gray dot hovering just above the letter L in my name. That is a scanner artifact from a 2021 tractor lease, I explained, the cold logic of the evidence hanging like a guillotine over the room. Lifted pixel for pixel, printed, and traced. It is felony forgery. This is absurd, a banker from Northeast Equity shouted, standing up so fast his chair crashed to the floor. We required a notarized signature in person. The notary swore under oath that you were present. The room fell dead silent as I slowly dragged my gaze away from the banker and pinned it entirely on my son. Theron was trembling. He looked like a hollowed-out shell of a man. The Scotch glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the faux hardwood floor, the amber liquid pooling around his expensive shoes. Look at the bottom of the screen, I told the banker, never breaking eye contact with Theron. On the massive projector, beneath the fake notary stamp, the bold, angled handwriting was painfully clear. witnessed and verified by Theron Vance. My son, I said, my voice suddenly stripped of all anger, leaving only a profound, echoing sorrow that silenced the entire barn, sat in your office and legally swore that his father was standing right beside him, signing away 100 years of our blood and sweat. He mortgaged my life to pay for this lie. He sold my grandfather's grave to buy his wife a lifestyle brand. Total chaos descended on the first Frost Gala. We're voiding the contract, Richard Sterling snarled, slamming the blue folder shut and tossing it onto the pristine white tablecloth. He pointed a trembling finger at Cressida, who was hyperventilating, gripping the acrylic podium as if it were the edge of a cliff. You lied about the volume. You lied about the product. You nearly dragged my entire corporation into a federal adulterated food scandal. My legal team will be in touch on Monday, and we will be seeking damages for every cent spent on this activation. Richard, wait, please. Cressida pleaded, her voice shrill, the elegant slate gray gown suddenly looking like a cheap costume. We can pivot. We can source legitimate syrup from Canada to fulfill the quota. I can fix the margins. You're done, Cressida. The lead banker from Northeast Equity barked, already walking toward the coat check. If that signature is forged, the collateral is void. That means the $1.5 million is an unsecured, fraudulent loan. You better pray you still have the principal in your accounts, or the FBI will be knocking on your door before Thanksgiving. Dad, please. Theron had stumbled away from the bar. He walked toward the podium, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. Tears were streaming down his face, leaving shiny tracks in the harsh white light of the projector. We didn't want to hurt you, Theron stammered, his voice breaking. He looked around at the departing executives, the fleeing wealth, the crumbling walls of his wife's empire. The farm was dying, Dad. We just wanted to save it. We just wanted to make it big enough to matter. I was going to tell you. I was going to pay off the mortgage before you ever found out. Cressida said it was just a temporary bridge. I stepped down from the podium. I walked until I was standing inches from my son. The music was gone. The investors were swarming the exits. The caterers had stopped serving, standing frozen against the walls, watching a family tear itself apart to the studs. A farm doesn't die because it stays small. Theron, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, meant only for him. It dies when the roots rot. You didn't do this to save my farm. You did this because you were too weak to tell your wife no. You chose her ambition over my name. I can fix it, Theron sobbed, grabbing the sleeve of my old wool suit. Dad, I can empty the accounts. I can give the bank their money back. Just don't press charges. Please. She'll go to prison. I'll go to prison. I looked at his hand clutching my sleeve. Then I looked up at Cressida, who was standing alone by the podium, watching her entire curated world burn to ash. There was no remorse in her eyes, only the frantic, calculating panic of a trapped animal calculating its next move. You can't unpoison a well, Theron, I said quietly, gently prying his fingers off my jacket. I turned my back on him. I walked down the center of the horseshoe table, past the abandoned glasses of champagne, past the fake, chemically treated maple leaves, and walked out the heavy barn doors into the freezing, honest air of the New York night. Behind me, the first Frost Gala was over. The lie was dead, but as I stood in the dark, listening to the wind howl through the bare branches of my grandfather's trees, I knew the hardest part, cutting out the rot so the tree could survive, was just beginning. The fallout from the first Frost Gala did not arrive with the dramatic shouting of a television courtroom. It arrived with the slow, crushing, and utterly silent weight of federal bureaucracy. By 9 o'clock the following Monday morning, the gravel driveway of Frost Hollow Farm was filled with vehicles, but none of them belonged to wealthy investors. There were 3 dark sedans from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, 2 white vans from the Food and Drug Administration, and local sheriff's deputies who immediately strung yellow crime scene tape across the doors of the tractor shed. I stood on the porch with Branston and my attorney, Arthur Penhaligon, drinking black coffee and watching the illusion of Cressida's empire get dismantled box by box. The FDA agents confiscated every single barrel of the high-fructose corn syrup and the chemical flavorings, meticulously logging them into evidence. The corporate world reacted with the ruthless self-preservation I expected. Richard Sterling, the apex executive who had been so eager to scale our heritage, was forced into an early, quiet retirement by the end of the week, his career irreparably tainted by his proximity to a massive food adulteration scandal. The board of Northeast Commercial Equity fired the loan officers who had blindly approved the $1.5 million transfer without conducting proper due diligence on the notary. As for Cressida, her unshakable confidence finally shattered under the fluorescent lights of a federal interrogation room. She tried to deploy her usual corporate doublespeak, attempting to frame the forged mortgage as an aggressive optimization strategy and the adulterated syrup as a misunderstood prototype. But the federal prosecutors didn't care about her marketing jargon. They cared about the paper trail. Arthur handed them everything: the emails between her and the chemical suppliers, the time-stamped digital lift of my signature from the office scanner, and the financial records showing she had used $60,000 of the stolen loan money to pay off her personal credit cards before the gala even began. She turned on Theron instantly, offering to testify that he was the mastermind in exchange for leniency. But the forensic accountants found the truth. She had engineered every shell company, every offshore transfer, and every fake invoice. 11 months after the gala, I sat in the back row of a federal courthouse in Albany and watched the judge hand down the sentence. For felony wire fraud, conspiracy to commit bank fraud, and mass violations of federal food safety standards, Cressida was sentenced to 60 months in a federal correctional institution, followed by 3 years of supervised release. She didn't look back at the gallery as the bailiff led her away. Her designer slate gray gown had been permanently traded for a standard-issue khaki jumpsuit. The lifestyle brand was dead. Theron's fate was a different kind of tragedy, one written not in prison time, but in the total evaporation of his identity. Because he had fully cooperated with the investigators, confessed immediately to the fraudulent notary stamp, and testified against Cressida's broader financial schemes, he avoided a federal prison sentence. Instead, the judge handed him 5 years of intense probation and ordered him to pay back the remaining $400,000 of the bank loan that hadn't been recovered from Cressida's frozen accounts. He was left with nothing. The divorce proceedings wiped out whatever small savings he had to his name. And to ensure that Frost Hollow would never again be leveraged for someone else's greed, Arthur drew up the paperwork to formally and irrevocably disinherit Theron. He was stripped of all future equity and ownership in the farm. To pay his court-ordered restitution, my son found employment at a commercial lumber yard 3 counties over, loading heavy kiln-dried boards onto flatbed trucks for $14 an hour. He came to the farm exactly once after the sentencing. He parked his battered, used sedan at the end of the driveway, too ashamed to pull up to the main house. I walked down to the gate to meet him. His hands were calloused now, his shoulders slumped beneath a cheap flannel jacket. He looked older, tired, but the nervous, hollow tension that had defined his marriage was gone. "I just came to get the rest of Mom's old photo albums," Theron said softly, looking at the frozen mud near my boots. "And I wanted to say I'm sorry. I know it doesn't fix it, but I'm sorry, Dad." I looked at the boy I had raised, recognizing that the punishment he was living was far worse than any anger I could hold on to. "Arthur left the box of albums in the mudroom for you," I said, my voice steady, stripped of malice but offering no false hope. "You can always come visit your mother's grave on the lower ridge, Theron. I won't ever stop you from doing that. But this land isn't yours anymore. You have to go build something of your own now. Something true." He nodded once, a sharp, painful jerk of his chin. He took the box, put it in his passenger seat, and drove away. I didn't watch him disappear down the road. I turned and walked back toward the trees. The hardest winter of my life eventually broke, giving way to a bright, piercingly clear New York spring. On the first Tuesday in March, Arthur Penhaligon drove up to the farmhouse with a thick stack of finalized legal binders. We sat at the scarred oak dining table, no laptops, no color-coded folders, just honest paper and black ink. With a few strokes of a pen, I transferred 51% of the equity of Frost Hollow Farm into an employee-owned cooperative trust. Branston, who had stood by me in the dark when my own blood had failed me, was named the senior managing partner. The young men and women who chopped our wood, tended our fires, and respected the soil were now owners of the legacy they helped protect. No single person, no matter their last name, could ever sell this land out from under them again. After Arthur left, I put on my heavy boots, zipped up my grandfather's faded wool coat, and walked out to the upper ridge. The air was crisp, holding the perfect, fragile balance between a freezing night and a thawing afternoon. The woods were entirely silent, save for the crunch of my boots on the lingering snow. I walked until I reached the oldest sugar maple on the property, a massive, gnarled giant whose roots were anchored deep into the rocky soil. I pulled a hand drill and a stainless steel spile from my pocket. I set the bit against the rough bark and turned the handle, the wood resisting for a moment before giving way, releasing the faint, sweet smell of raw timber. I tapped the spile into place with the heel of my hand and hung a clean, galvanized bucket beneath it. I stood perfectly still, letting the silence of the woods wash over me, and listened. Tap. A single, crystal-clear drop of sap fell into the bottom of the empty metal bucket. It was water drawn up from the deep earth, filtered through a century of roots, completely pure and entirely untouched by the greed of the world outside these woods. Tap. I smiled, the deep creases around my eyes tightening against the bright spring sun. The sap was running. The legacy was safe. And the math, brutal and honest as always, was finally right again.